So the advertised title has become slightly less grand in a sense, and it's now just arrows on maps, but hopefully no less interesting. So you're in for a treat of a double act. I'm going to start for the first half of the talk and then hand off to Alex, who's going to pick up the second half of the talk. And really the inspiration for this comes from thinking about how we represent the movements of people in this case in the context of war, but actually, or at least inspired by this context, but actually it's become a kind of a more general thinking about representation on maps, and particularly how we have come to use arrows actually to show a particular phenomenon. So the inspiration for this really kicked off back in March when I sent out a slightly provocative tweet actually about the way that refugees were being represented following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And my contention here was that I felt that the use of kind of proportional arrows, as you see on the map on the left, this was just a BBC example, but actually there were tens of other news outlets using exactly the same representation. I thought it was kind of something of an oversimplification. There were some limitations to the way that the data could be represented, because actually this was quite an early stage in the conflict, and they'd already gone kind of big on the big thick arrow, and they had nowhere else to go in terms of if the numbers of refugees increased, which they inevitably did, the arrows couldn't change much. And actually, crucially, it's very much a very same kind of visual language that are used in the context of kind of battlefield dynamics, invasions and threat and that kind of thing. And the broader context for this, and why I kind of felt confident in pushing out this provocation, was that I knew that I had a reasonable kind of following amongst the data journalism community, and I knew that that community had hugely expanded and evolved in the light of the COVID-19 pandemic. So actually, we're in quite an interesting position here, because going into the conflict, data journalism I knew was going to be a big part of this, or at least news organizations had the teams in place and the capacity to be more innovative, to think more innovatively about the way they represent these things. And overlaying on that, I think, is the public at large have become more kind of critical consumers of maps and visualizations, because they had seen so much during the pandemic. And so people's kind of visual and statistical literacy has kind of gone up a bit, I think. And that was a sense that I had. So we had this kind of combination of people wanting kind of more informative and interesting graphics, and teams who could respond to that. And so really this was a question that I was posing about, can we innovate, and are there ways that maps can use different forms of representation? And I'm pleased to say that there was a very positive response, and Alex will talk a bit about that very briefly at the end, about how different representations emerged. But what I wanted to focus on today, and what we wanted to talk about really, was how it came to be that an arrow such as this one was the kind of, or is the kind of go-to, the default representation for movements of people as well as troops and that kind of thing. And actually that there are kind of connotations and implications for that, which I think we should be aware of, and we should think more carefully about, because of their origins and how they're perceived, and what the original kind of intent and intention was. So the talk is going to be split into two different halves. I'm going to talk briefly about the kind of the quantitative aspects of how we represent, how we use arrows to represent data, So sort of, how we denote data through arrows. And then actually, Alex, I'm going to hand off to him. He's going to talk a bit more about sort of the connotative aspects of this, what it actually means to people when they see arrows, and what the intent is behind using them. So if we kind of think very kind of superficially about, how it came to be that we used arrows of different thickness to show movements of people or things, and so on, we can think, pretty quickly and delve into various textbooks of cartography. And the reason we use that representation is because that's what they suggest we use. So we've got kind of the red arrows here are from Elements of Cartography, Arthur Robinson's sort of classic text. We've got Handbook of Thematischen Cartography, which is a German book, to the left of that, which was published in the 60s. We've got the kind of the Monkhouse Maps and Diagrams book, which tells us about using arrows to show directions of movements of people. And then the bottom example here is in Bertan's Semiology of Graphics. And so, these are the kind of, the big starting points, of course, for anyone who has gone through an education or looking for inspiration in how we might use arrows to show movements and magnitudes of different movements. And so you take a big step back and you say, well, how did we get to this stage? How did we think about, say, the thickness of the line to denote the magnitude, the size of a phenomena? And the classic kind of two examples are Harness's Atlas of Irish Rail Travel, published in the 1830s. This is the first example of using line thickness to denote a quantity of something. So in the case of this map, it's the quantities of traffic along Irish railways. And you can instantly see kind of, how the thickness of the line is used to show that. And what's fascinating about this map is actually we're fortunate to have a copy of it in our map library at university, and it is huge. I mean, I thought these things were kind of an A4 sheet, but it is A2 sized map. So it reduces down quite nicely. But thinking about the medium, thinking about the constraints that cartographers in the news have today, you're trying to portray something on the size of a mobile phone right up to the size of a television. And so, that is a consideration that we're obviously sympathetic to when you're thinking about representation. And actually, this kind of line thickness approach can be quite effective even at these different scales. And, there's some discussion about whether Minard, how much he knew about Harness's work, but Charles Minard in the 1850s and 60s, this is the kind of the go-to diagram that many people will have seen and been familiar with, Napoleon's march on Moscow, again, showing line thickness to denote the volume of troops moving both to Moscow in the kind of the fleshy color and then from Moscow in the black. And what's interesting here is that these examples, they don't show any real direction. It's kind of implicit, but they're not using arrowheads in a way that we've seen in the news articles that I showed. And so we think, well, where did arrows come from and what were arrows used for? So the first kind of use of arrows was in the 18th century to denote the flow of rivers. So this is an example by Philip Pittman showing the Mississippi. And you can just about see kind of a very kind of a nicely elegant kind of flecked thin arrow, not showing anything with any real magnitude, but clearly showing direction. We can move forward 100 or so years, and we can actually see how arrows are used or start to be used to show the movements of people. So this is a famous paper from Ravenstein in the 1880s, where he talks about the currents of migration, and you can see here how he's used arrows. There's some variation in thickness, but he's showing quite a detailed picture of the movements of people in the British Isles. And this approach is actually emulated, subsequently by others. Here's a version from W.E.B. Du Bois, published in 1917, which is showing the movements from the south of formerly enslaved African Americans northwards in America. And this was based on quite a detailed survey that they undertook to show the movements of these people. But it's a kind of a detailed cobweb of different interlocking lines, quite hard to sense magnitude, even though some of these arrows are converging as destination areas are reached from a variety of origins. And actually, there's a nice example from another book called La Péninsule Balkanique published in 1918, so around the same time of this, where, again, incredibly, this is showing the movement of different ethnic groups in the Balkans. And this actually does the opposite. So rather than converging at the points of destination, we actually see that there's a divergence from the points of origin. So we have thick lines of origin and then kind of these arrows fanning out. But what's interesting here, of course, is that there's no combination between the thickness of the line and the magnitude. So I'm going to hand over to Alex now, who's going to talk a bit about how those two things came together.
Yeah, thanks, James. Hopefully you can hear me all right and everything's okay. Yeah, good. Okay, so I think, first of all, maybe the thing to say is that what is really helpful when we're talking about cartographic symbology and representation and trying to understand how we are effectively wanting to communicate maybe a message, that, as James already helpfully said, we've got the denotative possibilities of symbology. So what we're trying to show through denotation, like magnitude, direction, that sort of thing. But there's also, of course, what we want to maybe suggest through the style, the design of those arrows and of those symbologies. So I think one of the key things in all of this, really, in this discussion that James and I had, is to sort of recognize the denotative power and the connotative power of cartography and of those symbols, and particularly, of course, with arrows. So what do arrows then actually suggest? Why would they be used in the first place beyond just showing the quantities, for example, and their denotation, let's say? Well, I think, first of all, maybe it's important to say, obviously, arrows showing movement. That's something that is very, very clear. But perhaps maybe on another level, they suggest something which is disruptive, perhaps, to maybe the static order of the world. I mean, it would be quite blunt to say they represent change, but I think there is an element there of disruption, perhaps. And let's think about that a little bit more, maybe unpack it as we go through and look at some of this construction, let's say, of the connotations. I think also we have to bear in mind that variables such as visual variables like color, use of color for arrows, and the visual hierarchy, how dominant particular features are, particularly arrows, actually means that they are much more suggestive as well of particular ideas and therefore particular connotations. So if we go back in time and we have a look at one of the first uses on the next slide of Franz Ritter von Hauslab's maps here, and you might recognize this. This was used on the cover of the Cartographic Journal a few volumes ago. And if you look at this, you might think, oh, this is a very abstract and interesting art form. So this is from 1845. And Franz Ritter von Hauslab here was interested in showing what the invasion axes were to Vienna. This is obviously as a military map, and effectively to show what the obstacles in terms of terrain would be to those invasions. So effectively you've got the darker colors, the darker greens that are showing here, the Alps, for example, and other mountain ranges. You might be able to work out that that's Venice in the bottom of the map at the top of the Adriatic Sea, for example. But have a look at the arrows and think about perhaps how their colour has been used here to connote a threat, and also if you can also see that the style of those arrows is very much like that which James showed a moment ago with the map of the Mississippi, the plan of Mobile there, effectively saying that this is a continuation of that style of arrow. So very elegant, very sharp, very pointed, but we start to see perhaps that first connotation of threat in that these are invasion axes. And again, perhaps we might say, well, there is a continuation of the idea of what an arrow should look like from the 18th century right through into the mid 19th century. So the use of colour here, I think, quite important to connote a sense of threat. Well, if you move forward again, maybe just under another 100 years, effectively, we get to the situation where this is the interwar period, and we start to see the creation of a particular body of maps, of cartography, that was used in the Zeitschrift für Geopolitik magazine, which was effectively a magazine on popular geopolitics that was edited by Karl Haushofer, who was the professor at Munich University at the time. But more importantly, as we saw the development of arrows and the use of arrows, we actually get to a point in the interwar years in the Zeitschrift für Geopolitik where actually there is almost like a stylistic specification sheet here in terms of how you would show different features and different situations using different styles of arrows. And this is really quite significant because actually, if we think about the use of a lot of these maps that were in the Zeitschrift für Geopolitik, they were effectively to support Nazi ideology at the time and the lead up to World War II, particularly to show how vulnerable Germany was after the Treaty of Versailles. So what I want to draw your attention to a little bit more specifically is if you can have a look at the top of the second column there at number 10, that particular style of arrow there, it's called a radiation arrow, and it's supposed to show the splitting of an attack into different directions. The arrows therefore representing the relationship of what's called the power currents between different elements of that thrust of attack. But again, this being used very much as showing military movement, if you like, and military purposes, but nonetheless to give an indication. So if we go on to the next slide, you'll see an example of how this has actually been used, this style and these styles of arrows, to effectively communicate movements, and particularly military movements. So here this is looking at the Franco-German battle basically over the Saarland. And effectively, this is from 1935, the idea again of using these very thick, broad, dominant arrows. And if we go forward again, we'll see another example. On the left-hand side here, this is from Schumacher's map to show the encirclement of Germany. And again, using that similar style of very broad arrows to give a sense that Germany here is vulnerable because it's surrounded by this group of countries that are keen to persecute and effectively demobilize and destroy it, more to the point really after the Treaty of Versailles. But again, to support that ideology of Germany being hard done by at the behest of the Allies after the Treaty of Versailles. If we have a look on the right-hand side, you might see again there's some similarities here in terms of encirclement that was used here on the map. You might recognise this one. This was a leaflet that was dropped on the Allied troops in the lead up to Dunkirk to effectively try and convince the Allied troops, the British Expeditionary Force, for example, in 1940, to surrender and give up rather than obviously carrying on fighting. Again, the idea of arrows showing not just the advance into France, but also the encirclement of the Allied troops and their vulnerability. So we start to see through this period then, particularly, maybe more pointedly within this particular style of mapping that emerged in Germany, this whole idea of something which is really quite strong and blunt in terms of a general process of communicating effectively movement and encirclement. Okay, so just to make the point going forward, if you have a look at elsewhere what was going on around the world. Some other examples, and again, it's probably, well, it is important to stress here, it wasn't just Germany that was using this idea. I've got the map on the left here, map from 1934 from Japan. You'll see Japan's really center in this projection, the Mercator projection, funny enough, but showing here the exports to other parts of the world of goods from Japan. So Japanese products travel the world here, use of red, again, very, very strong in terms of suggesting that dominance worldwide. And again, a map on the right-hand side, perhaps the start or the continuation really of maps and arrows in maps being used for journalistic purposes, really again as a way to communicate a very simple message to a broader audience about what is the general situation happening in a particular place at a particular time. So here we've got the Japanese invasion of Indochina, now Vietnam, of course, and then other parts of the East Indies, if you like, during, of course, the early stages of World War II. This is 1941, and it's a US publication, Seattle Post-Intelligencer. But I think the important thing to say here with these is that, again, as a side, as in a different sort of evolution to what James was talking about, this is where there are no quantities that are assigned to these arrows. They're purely there to suggest and express. And maybe I might be stretching things a little bit, but maybe to say that if this use of an arrow is very suggestive, perhaps coming from Nazi ideology, and maybe then perhaps Nietzsche's idea of the will, maybe the idea here is for an arrow to express something of the will. I think there's something maybe to explore with that idea. So if we go forward a little bit more and having a look at the use of these arrows then and how they've continued really over time, we've got a sense perhaps, and you'll recognize some of these, I think, we've got a sense of how, again, those blunt, if you like, quite broad and generalized arrows have been used not necessarily to denote something very specific, but actually to make much more suggestive connotations. And the point is perhaps that those connotations can almost invariably be seen as negative connotations. So you'll recognize the start of the opening sequence there of that map there from Dad's Army that ran from 1968 to 1977. Incidentally, the opening sequence was going to be film of Nazi troops and refugees moving, and that was deemed to be too insensitive by the BBC, so they opted for this animated sequence of these arrows, which again was supposed to give an idea of comedy that the BBC didn't think was too insensitive. But again, you'll recognise some of these, again, maps showing migration and circles here. We'll come back to that idea from 2015. This is the Economist, the top right. Bottom right, we see a map that you may well recognise. Again, the use of a single arrow and a single red arrow from the Balkans and the Middle East, showing effectively the threat of immigration posed by these countries should they join the EU, for example. This was a map used by the Vote Leave campaign in 2016. And again, the idea here is not to show really anything to do with quantity, even though there are some data points that are added there, but really to give an impression and therefore to trigger emotions, trigger certain emotions. Look at the UK, that's in a very passive blue colour. And going back to the original point of this discussion, really looking at how maps have been used much more recently to show the invasion of Ukraine. This is from the Washington Post. So the two arrows then being used in very different, same ways, if you like, but actually for different things, migration and for invasion of troops. And this has again drawn some criticism because the invasion perhaps wasn't quite as orderly, as organised as the map maybe on the left, bottom left, sort of encourages you to think, perhaps. So moving forward and looking at where we're at much more recently, and this specific issue that James was talking about now, really, is it appropriate for this very large, broad set of arrows, for example, that cartographic vocabulary to really be appropriate to be used for showing refugees that are fleeing from Ukraine, for example, and how then there's been an immediate response to that criticism, really, in terms of coming up with different solutions for these, very much indeed. So, for example, Financial Times, the top right, BBC, The Economist, and then bottom left, we've got the APF or AFP News Agency, the UN High Commission of Refugees, the World Economic Forum, again, using graduated circles in this case, rather than arrows directly, even though, of course, there are some slightly different ways of showing arrows in this that we've discovered. But the point being really perhaps that through that criticism and through that rethinking of some of the ways in which some of the arrows and some of the other symbology has been used, there's really a prompting of a rethink there in terms of our cartographic language. And I think that maybe comes back to maybe a bigger point about this whole discussion and exercise, really, in that we have to perhaps wake up to the fact that cartography, I guess, uses a visual language of expression that itself needs to evolve as society and culture evolves to be more effective in order to communicate to a particular audience at a particular time. So cartography is really something that doesn't stand still. So if you're talking about mapping for movement, well, we have to remember that cartography also is in a process of movement, I think, as well. And ultimately, then, that means that we need to adapt to show what we need to show more effectively. So I think that's it. Thank you very much indeed. There's another nice map for you to look at. Arrows this time from the US, emanating around the world. But yeah, thanks very much. Look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks, James and Alex. That was a really fascinating presentation. And I did actually wonder at the start of the talk how long it would be before Dad's Army made an appearance in there. So.
Yeah. Not very long.
So we're just waiting for any questions that might come in through the chat. There isn't any there at the moment. Well, I guess my question will be about how, obviously, arrows are still very much in the media, as you've seen with the Ukrainian war. Do you think that actual animations are really phasing out some of these maps? How does that, I mean, how do if you're looking at animations, do you think they face the same problems as a static map? Because I guess in a way it is really just a way of animating a static map to make it more understandable. What are your thoughts on that?
Do you want to go first on that one, James, or do you want me?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the key thing here is the context in which a lot of these things are being used. So, you know, in the case of the early arrows, it was kind of like the instinctive reaction was to show refugees in this way, and actually to kind of sympathize with the job that people who are creating these maps have to do. They are having to run it across multiple different formats and things like that. And so actually an animation is not necessarily going to be what you need. It has to be a static map that can be a small thumbnail on a phone and that sort of thing. And so, you know, we still need static representations, I think, of these things. And then in terms of the animation, then of course, well, it depends on what you're animating and how you're animating it, because Vote Leave did a very effective video, which was all Dad's Army arrows, you know, piling into the UK with money falling from the sky and all that kind of stuff. And so you can create an animation, of course, that is extremely emotive, one way or the other. Equally, you could use a more kind of sensitive form of visualization. So that's one thing. And then the other thing, just very quickly to say, is the other point I made kind of in the tweet is actually, and this is true of all the maps that we've shown here, they're actually quite data poor. We don't have a huge amount of data to show in the early examples, only a few numbers. And so, you know, you can make heroic assumptions. Those small arrow movement maps I showed were all heroic assumptions people were making about precision of the data they had, but they didn't really have that much. And again, an animation, it probably facilitates more data, and it probably needs a bit more data than perhaps we had at the outset.
Yeah. If I could just add to that, I think, yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, for animation to work, you know, it is a process of generalization. You have to have a sequence in order to fill in the data. And if you don't have the data, then you have to interpolate, and that can make something that's already generalized even more generalized. I suppose, you know, it's an interesting question, Henry, as well, because I guess from the perspective of wanting to create an effect and maybe generate emotion and trigger emotion within a reader or a user of the maps, or somebody who's looking at the animation, well, you know, we live in a world of the motion picture, of moving pictures and so on. And, we look at, we're saturated by news 24 hours a day, for example, and they function throughout the use of, or through the use of moving pictures and so on. So we're kind of used to that. I think what is really curious here is that translation of the moving picture to the conveyance of information through a map, and whether there is maybe something that is lost in terms of authority, perhaps when you start to see maybe maps that are animated, that really maybe people start to look at them maybe as entertainment rather than something which is authoritative in terms of conveying data. Now, I don't know the answer to that, but it might be really interesting to maybe conduct some user studies and try and understand actually, do people see animated maps as authoritative as maybe static maps? And maybe something quite interesting there is that if you think about it, what are the what's the graphical heritage, you might say, that goes behind animation and animated maps? Well, it might be more aligned to something like cartoons than anything else. And so does that mean that it triggers something in the mind that makes you actually look at maps like this as cartoons rather than as something maybe too factual? I mean, I don't know the answer, but it's, I think, perhaps fascinating to explore that a little bit more. So yeah, good question. Thank you.
Yeah, that perception. Yeah, it's a really interesting thing to have to think about, and perhaps a study for the future.
I'm sure you're right.
I'm just going to ask one more question. There are a few questions that have come in, so maybe James and Alex, if you want to have a look at them when we move on to the next presentation and answer them in the chat, that'd be good. I'm just going to ask the one from Jerry.
Yeah.
And he's asked, how has official military notation developed in battle maps internationally?
Right. My understanding, there will be experts that know far more about this than I do. My sort of experience is more related to Soviet and Russian mapping than it is to the UK or NATO, I suppose. I think, when we have, if we're talking about battle and tactical mapping, I think what we start to see from my experience is much greater representation, for example, of different units and different styles of warfare as those units and styles of warfare have developed, but still relying on basic notation and basic symbology to convey movement of troops, for example, and the positions of those troops. There is, I should say, a very fascinating paper which is just about to come out in the Cartographic journal, which looks at precisely this in terms of Soviet and Russian military map symbology from a tactical perspective. And without stealing any thunder there from Charles in the US Army, who's written the paper, I mean, effectively, you can see here how a lot of that symbology actually originates from the Prussian wars, and actually before that, really, and it's a continuation, funnily enough, of that same sort of idea. But ultimately, as units and as means of warfare develop, there has to be change in terms of showing those, but still in a way that communicates effectively to people so that they can, on the battlefields, they can understand. But there will be experts that understand this, and obviously direct that far more than I do. NATO, of course, has standard and STANAGs, the standardization agreements over precisely what should be shown and how. And as with any kind of mapping, you'd expect that symbology to grow to reflect, of course, changing means of warfare. I don't know if James wants to say anything on that.
No, but I would make a very brief pivot to the Ukraine thing, which is actually interesting how paper maps and that kind of imagery became such a prominent part at the beginning of the war. So, you had the president of Belarus, stood in front of revealing military secrets, I think accidentally, but it stood in front of a paper map with a stick, pointing at it. And there's European leaders planning visits to Ukraine, photographed, huddled around a paper map. And so to come back to Alex's point about sort of the evolution and change of, cartography, I think, war does trigger innovation, and it certainly has in this case, I think.
Yeah.
But it's also interesting how, there's a lot of continuity. The things that people reach for in their imagery around this is actually, it does date back much, to the Second World War period, and the way that conflict was portrayed on maps in that way. So, yeah, that's all I would add to that.
Yeah, can I just add something else, Henry, about that, which is quite interesting, in that the captured Russian maps that I've seen so far that the Russian military are using, and again, this needs a lot more research and verification. But the captured Russian maps that I've seen, for example, posted on Twitter, almost show a kind of a retrograde direction that the Russian military have taken in terms of their tactical mapping compared to the Soviet mapping that you see, where, again, others will be able to comment on this, but the quality, let's say, seems to have gone backwards. We'll leave it at that.
Interesting. Thank you very much, James and Alex.